and welcome. I am Beth Scripps, and I'm the director of the American Frontier Culture Foundation. We are excited that this lecture series is now a full year of once-a-month talks, and we hope to see you all at each one. The foundation is proud to have secured funding for the full year of the lecture series, and we'd like to say a special thank you to the Virginia Humanities, who generously funded the honoraria for this year's speakers. We'd also like to thank our Shenandoah Society members for their commitment, and we thank you for coming and for your support of the Frontier Culture Museum. If you are unfamiliar with the work of the museum and the foundation, we do have some newsletters. They're back on the coffee cookie table, and there's lots of contact information for us in there. And now, without further ado, here's Megan Newman, Executive Director of the museum.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out on this blistering cold evening. But this is a program that is near and dear to our hearts, and the staff always enjoys the opportunity to meet the speakers and to learn about the work that they're doing and to be able to share all that with you. We're pleased this evening to have Dr. Scott joining us here to speak about all things iron making in the frontier. Dr. Scott grew up in Virginia. After having served in the U.S. Navy for a while, he earned a degree in history at Virginia Tech. Yay, historians! It's possible I have a thing for historians. He later went on to earn a master's degree from Virginia Tech and a doctoral degree in educational technology from East Tennessee State University. No, I lied. Did I mess that up? I reversed it. Reversed that. You just told me you wanted to go back to school again. I just didn't have it for you. He is the former president of Williamsburg Technical Community College in South Carolina and Rappahannock Community College here in Virginia. After his retirement, Dr. Scott returned to doing some research and rekindled his interest in all things iron, the iron industry, and he's since published several books on the subject, some of which are available there in the back of the room for you all to take a look at. And if you're interested in speaking to Dr. Scott, he's certainly available as well. Now, Ms. Scripps mentioned that we had secured some support from the Virginia Humanities for our programming this year, so please do not hesitate to grab a calendar at the back. We have the schedule for the programming throughout the course of the year, and we also have a survey that we would very much appreciate if you took the opportunity to grab a copy of it back at the snack table and complete that. It's for our own information about how we can better run the program and maybe some other kinds of lectures that you might be interested in seeing, and also we can give some report back to the folks who provide some support. So maybe they'll provide us some support. All right, please join us, Dr. Scott. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you all very much for coming to hear me talk about something that I find most interesting, and I hope you'll find it as interesting as well. Can you hear me okay, everybody?
Yeah.
All right, we need to get the...
Do you want to go this way?
All right here.
You're fine.
Okay. First let me just tell you a little bit about what I'm doing. I really didn't start my researching and writing about the iron history until after I retired. So this is a retirement project for me. Now granted, I grew up in Clifton Forge, but you can well imagine there's a lot of iron industry over there. And as a kid, I used to explore the iron mines and the furnaces and whatnot, and I got an interest in it. I really didn't do anything until after I retired. So I'm not a professional historian, I'm not a professional writer, I'm not a geologist, I'm not a chemist, I'm not a metallurgist. Everything I've learned has pretty much been just the last 12 years or so. Now, what I decided to do was to see if I could gather as much information as possible about the early iron industry of Virginia, and I've decided to restrict my research to the Valley of Virginia, which is pretty much the western slope of the Blue Ridge and the eastern slope of the Alleghenies, all the way from Frederick County in the north to Lee County in the south. But the area is so large and there's so much information that I decided to break it down into 4 books, and I've done 3. As you can see, Iron in the Gap deals with Wise and Lee County, River of Iron deals with Augusta, Allegheny, Botetourt. And Shenandoah Iron deals primarily with Rockingham County north to Frederick County. And the last book, which I'm currently working on, hopefully will finish this year, is Big Lick, Cripple Creek, and Rye Valley Iron, which will cover from Roanoke County all the way down to Washington County. So that's what I'm doing. Now, by the mid-1700s, the settlers had pretty well moved into the valley. And there really wasn't much way they could move in except to come either north or south, because the Blue Ridge Mountains blocked the egress from the eastern part of Virginia. And so the main route was what used to be the Great Indian War Path, sometimes called that. And the road came right down the valley, and many of the settlers came from Pennsylvania. As Pennsylvania became crowded, the settlers in Pennsylvania moved more and more west, and eventually spilled into the Shenandoah Valley, and then came southward, and eventually settled pretty much all the way down here to Augusta County. You have a lot of German influence from the Pennsylvania settlers. That was pretty much the way transportation had to occur, was on that great road, because there just wasn't any other way to get across the mountains for the most part. Now, the settlers found that the needs were pretty well met. The valley is very rich agriculturally, so they were able to create their homesteads and farm and raise pretty much what they needed. The forests were there, so they could have wood and whatnot they needed to build their dwellings. However, iron products, of course, were the most difficult, and they were heavy, so you couldn't be hauling them in and out as easy as you might be doing that with some other ingredient. Now, fortunately, the valley is full of iron ore. And so it didn't take the settlers long to discover that, and they began to then founder and produce their own iron implements. Well, there are several different kinds of iron in the valley, but the two most prevalent kinds are limonite and hematite. And as you can see by the formula, they're both iron oxides. Usually they were found either in layers or in regular deposits, often mixed with a lot of clay. And the iron that we have in the valley here is pretty rich, 65% metallic iron. So that's pretty rich iron ore. Now, if you look at a map of the iron ore beds of Virginia, you can see how they pretty much go just right down here along the slope of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and then over in the west on the eastern side of the Allegheny Mountains, all the way down the entire valley, and even over into Lee and Wise County. There was, of course, some iron in the rest of Virginia, but for the most part, we're talking about the iron ore beds along here in the valley. Now, the early settlers, as they began to process the iron that they found, they would start off by using a very simple, what was called a Bloomery Forge. Here they would just basically have an open hearth. They fueled it with wood, which eventually would burn down to charcoal. They had a bellows where they'd fan it to make the fire very hot. And they would actually take lumps of iron ore and put it directly into the fire, take tongs, and take the iron ore out and put it on an anvil and pound on it. And as they pounded on it, of course, the iron molecules compacted together, and as it cooled, the other molecules of the impurities would crack and break away, and eventually they could produce what was called a bloom. And what they would do is they would heat it, pound it, heat it, pound it, keep doing that until they ended up with a bloom. Now, the Bloomery Forge produced maybe 100 pounds of iron per firing, which was not a lot of iron. And here's what an iron bloom looks like after it's been pounded. And so this is kind of what they ended up with. They could take that then to a forge, to another forge, and reheat it and repound it and eventually make iron bars out of it, and then take the iron bars and cut them up and make nails, or bend them into horseshoes, or make axe heads. So they were able to actually make their own iron implements. And the interesting thing about it is, by using the Bloomery Forge, they skipped an important process in iron making. By pounding on the iron with a hammer, they were actually creating wrought iron. which is fairly strong because it's very fibrous, and the iron molecules are bonded together. So it's a very strong form of iron, not like you're going to see later in the furnaces, which created cast iron. So they were actually able to create wrought iron directly from the bloomery process. Now, by 1790s, the settlements were well established, but transportation was still a major issue, because again, there's only mainly one way to get in and out of the valley. But yet the homesteads in the valley were producing a tremendous amount of farm goods, corn, wheat, whiskey, of course, and their farm animals produced lots of meat, and all this was a surplus to them, but it was greatly needed in the markets of the east. Unfortunately, the Blue Ridge Mountains were in the way, and that was the big problem of getting those commodities to the eastern part of Virginia. And there's really very little interest in the eastern landowners spending a whole lot of money in developing trans-mountain roads because they're very expensive, and of course any other way to get ingredients and materials and supplies across the mountains. But over time, the roads were improved, as you see, a greatly improved road there, and you could carry larger and heavier loads. But of course, iron products, again, were a little more difficult. I mean, try to imagine loading up a wagon full of iron and taking it across these kind of roads. I mean, you'd beat the wagon to death before you even got to where you were going to go. And so the rivers were improved. And the Shenandoah River actually was navigable from Grottoes all the way to Harper's Ferry. In fact, you know where Bridgewater is, it used to be called Bridgeport, because it's actually a port where commodities and iron was loaded on to these gondolas and taken down the Shenandoah River. The James River Canal also became navigable from Lexington all the way to Richmond. Well, there's a greater and greater demand of iron in the east and the northeast. The railroads were beginning to be built. Great quantities of iron were needed for iron rails, for bridges, for all sorts of things. And many of the Pennsylvania iron masters who learned their trade in Pennsylvania moved into the valley, and they brought the technology and skills for making iron. Now, pretty good sized quantities of iron could be shipped north on the Shenandoah River and east on the James River. Also, railroads were beginning to expand into the valley. They began to creep down. The Virginia and Tennessee River came from Lexington over to Roanoke, and it went southward. That was before the Civil War. The railroads began to creep into the northern Shenandoah Valley before the war. So the railroads were expanding, and of course, with railroads you can carry very heavy materials. And there were abundant ingredients in the valley for making large quantities of iron. So what do you need to smelt iron? Well, you need primarily three things. You need iron ore, which is the iron oxide, fuel, and charcoal was what was the main fuel used. And around this area, I mean, forests just are abounding, so there's just tremendous amounts of charcoal. And you need a limestone for flux. The whole valley floor is just literally limestone. So there's plenty of all of that. And I just thought I'd mention that iron oxide smelts at 2,282 degrees. That's pretty hot. So it would take something to make all that work. Well, by 1830s, the Bloomery Forges were pretty much on the decline, and they were replaced by another device called the coal blast charcoal furnace. And it was called coal blast because it just used ordinary air, and it's called charcoal because it used charcoal for fuel. And they were pretty typical. One furnace looked pretty much like the next furnace, and they were scattered all up and down the valley. And what you saw, they were mostly just a truncated pyramid made of large stone blocks. Usually they had a 4-arch in the front, and on the side they had a thyr arch. Another arch just like the 4-arch, but it was used for poking the thyr pipe, which is where the air went through. That was called the thyr arch, and of course it had a flat top. Oops, what did I do? Okay, operator error. Okay, can you help me there? Yep. All right, there we go. Thank you. Okay, now the furnace didn't exist by itself. It was part of a complex, and they were usually called an iron plantation. And you can see, of course, the furnace right here, and here's the cast house attached to it. Over here's the bellows and the sear right there. Usually there was a blacksmith shop. Sometimes there was a foundry. There's always dwellings, structures, and cafeteria to feed the workers. They had houses for the workers to live in. Usually the ironmonger who owned the furnace usually lived in a very large house located usually at the top of the hill. Now the iron plantation was very labor intensive because you've got to make charcoal, you've got to mine iron ore and limestone, you've got to operate the furnace. In order to feed the workers, you need to have a farm, and you had to grow crops and raise animals. Of course, you had to do milling and cooking and baking and blacksmithing, and you had to make clothes, shoes, harnesses, and iron tools. It's all part of the operation of the iron plantation. Now let's talk a little bit about charcoal. All right, this is just a rough calculation based on several different sources that it came off with. Every time you read something about how much charcoal it makes to make a ton of iron, you'll find something a little bit different. But I sort of averaged them out, came up with this. And the furnace ran for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week once it got started, because once it got hot, you couldn't very well just stop and let it cool down. So it also ran for 8 to 10 months at a time, usually, most of the year. My calculation is that'd be 240 days or 5,760 hours. If you burn 3 cords of wood every 2 hours, it would need 8,640 cords of wood in order to run a furnace for 1 season. This is about 300 acres of land. So you can imagine the amount of woodland that was literally stripped from the mountains. And interestingly enough, of course, this is just one furnace, and there were several operating at the same time. Most of the iron men, when they would buy land and put a furnace on it, would own thousands of acres because they needed all the woodland in order to provide for the charcoal. Now, the charcoal was produced in a charcoal pit. And that's, of course, a misnomer because it wasn't actually a hole in the ground. It was literally a flattened earth area, and they would pound it down flat, hard, packed, so it could be raked easily. And they would take the wood and chop it up and stack it up into kind of a cone-like, and they would leave a little chimney right in the middle. And then when it was time to light it, they could throw kindling down in the chimney, light the kindling, and then the fire would eventually burn from the chimney outward. But it had to be covered with earth because you had to prevent the fire from burning. You wanted it to char the wood, not burn the wood. And so they had to carefully control the amount of air that got into the fire. And usually they dig a little hole at the bottom and allow the air to come into the bottom and go up the chimney. But they had to be very careful as not to let too much air in because the thing would catch on fire and get flames, and you'd burn your wood up, and you wouldn't have charcoal. And you can see there in that picture some steps that were made so that Collier could climb up the steps to get to the chimney. Often there was more than one charcoal pit going at one time, and so the master Collier had to be on duty 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for however long it took to char the wood. And he had to watch out because of if as the wood charred, it sort of shrunk, and of course it would break open a place in the earth, and air would come in, and then next thing you know, you had a fire, so he'd have to run over. He and his crew would have to run over and shovel some dirt up on the various places. So they had to watch this constantly during the charring process. And when they finished, then they would eventually, when the Collier thought this charcoal was ready, he would take rakes, and they would pull that mound down, spread the charcoal out, and then put out the fire, put out any burning embers. And then after it cooled, they would shovel it up and put it in these wagons and haul it from the charcoal pit to the furnace. At the furnace, there was usually Storage shed. They tried to keep their ingredients underneath a roof because obviously you don't want to put charcoal outside and let it get rained on. Same with the iron ore and everything else. Now, of course, they also had to mine for iron ore limestone. Usually the iron ore had to be dug out from either drifts, which are, you know, a horizontal shaft, or an open pit, or a vertical shaft. And the limestone, usually because it's so, you know, limestone's everywhere around here. And so they consequently go to the hillside, start pulling it away, and they could find limestone pretty easy, and they would usually have an open pit, usually pretty close to the furnace. Sometimes the iron ore had to be hauled for a good distance, and sometimes the charcoal, as they cut the forest down, they'd have to haul the charcoal farther and farther, you know, because it was farther and farther away as they ran out of forest. Well, let's kind of look at the typical coal blast charcoal furnace. It was usually about 30 feet square at the base, 20 feet square at the top, 30 to 35 feet high, but they were able to produce 3 to 6 tons of iron a day. That's a lot different from the hundreds of pounds of iron that a Bloomery Forge could produce. And of course, they produced a liquid, and it was a cast iron as opposed to the Bloomery wrought iron. So let's kind of look at a diagram of the furnace here. Well, here's the actual furnace right here. And even though the outside looks straight, if you look at the inside, it's really like an inverted funnel. And it inverts down to this point right here, and that's called the Bosch. And there it tapers inward, and then you have here the crucible. And the liquid iron, as it smelts and separates itself from the ore, trickles down into the crucible. Here you have the bellows blowing air in through the thayer arch into the thayer, and usually the thayer, the air came from a wooden pipe, but when it got to the furnace, it had to have a clay nozzle because obviously wood would burn up. So the thayer was usually made of clay, and of course you used a water wheel was used in order to operate the bellows. Now, the furnace usually had to be next to a hillside because in order to get the ingredients to the top of the furnace, they would usually have a bridge that would go from the hill over to the top of the furnace where it could just be rolled over and dumped into the top. And of course, it also had to be near a stream because you needed water power to operate the bellows. All right, so here you see fillers at the top loading the ingredients in. They would dump in like a wheelbarrow full of charcoal, a wheelbarrow full of limestone, a wheelbarrow full of iron ore, but you know they had a different formula. So many wheelbarrows of iron ore versus so much limestone. And sometimes the ironmasters kept that secret because they didn't want their competitor to know exactly how they were making their iron. And then of course at the bottom of the furnace, at the forearch, was where the cast house is located. And here you see a worker who is tapping the furnace through the forearch and allowing the molten iron to flow out. Now, usually the way that worked was since all the liquid was melting, it was all melted into a liquid, and so you had not only the iron, but you also had all the impurities. The other parts mixed in with the iron ore. But the iron being heaviest would always go to the bottom of the crucible, and the rest of it would float on top. You know, you've done that experiment where you took water and olive oil, you know, you shake it up in a jar and you watch it, you know, the oil floats to the top. Well, that's exactly what happened here. And so the slag would float to the top. So as a consequence, you had two notches, or they call them notches, or little holes, one above the other. And they were filled with clay. And so it's time to tap the furnace. The ironmaster first would knock out the little clay plug and allow the slag to pour out over to the side. And then after that was all gone, then you could go down lower and knock the lower plug out, which is called the iron notch, and out would flow the liquid iron into the cast house. So we'll look at this diagram again, and again you can see a little different. Here, of course, is the bridge house, the bridge coming from the hillside over which the fillers can then dump the various ingredients into the top of the furnace. And you can see that the furnace is mostly the rock structure on the outside, but on the inside of the furnace, in this inverted funnel, was lined with brick. And what they would do is they would take a mixture of clay and salt and lime, sometimes some sand to get the silicon, and then make a plaster. And when they built the furnace, they would go in and they would plaster the inside of that brick. And then when the furnace got hot, it would literally glaze the inside of the bricks to protect them from this tremendous amount of heat that would be generated. And here you can see the bellows over here. Excuse me, here are the bellows. And this particular style is a double bellows, and so it works like this. So there's a constant supply of air being pushed into the furnace. And of course it was pushed through this pipe down into the thearch. And then the water wheel, of course, powered the bellows. And here you have a man tapping the slag off. In front of the forearch was the cast house. And here you see a worker, and he is channeling the iron as it flows out of this little pipe here into these molds, into this cast house floor. The molds are made usually, there's sand usually put on the bottom of the cast house. And usually there's a mixture of sand and clay, because that way you could shape it a little better than you could just loose sand. So in the cast house, you had this arrangement of the central trench, and the iron would come out of the furnace, flow through the central trench, and then be directed into these perpendicular molds that you see. And so this is where the cast house floor looked. And that arrangement of the central trench and the perpendicular molds so resembled a mother sow suckling her piglets that this was called the sow, the central trench, and the perpendicular molds were all called pigs. And that's where the term pig iron comes from. And here's what pigs look like. Now, a lot of the furnaces would brand their pig iron. They would actually put an impression in the sand molds so that when the pigs were made, they would actually have the name of the furnace on it. Because a furnace master dealt in a certain kind of iron. Some had more carbon in it, some iron had more magnesium, manganese in it, and so different iron buyers wanted certain kinds of irons with certain characteristics. So they knew that they could depend on getting the same kind of iron if the iron came from the same furnace. And so the quality of the iron was very important. And so they branded their iron to make sure that their buyer knew that they were getting the iron. This happens to be from the Liberty Furnace in Shenandoah County. Now, I came across this interesting looking thing here. These were gutterman shoes. Now, the gutterman was the man who was down at in the cast house, and he was helping the iron move through the central trench and into the pigs. And of course, he had to hop around on the hot sand, and so he would make himself a pair of overshoes, which were basically he'd nail a big thick piece of wood onto the bottom of an old pair of shoes, and he would wear these over his regular shoes to protect his feet. And so I actually came across those, and the owner didn't have any idea what they were. And I said, I know exactly what those are. Those are gutterman shoes. Now, believe it or not, I've been able to find at least 118 of these furnaces in the valley. So there's a lot of this stuff going on. Now, they didn't all operate at the same time. Some would open, close, others would open later and close. But over a period of 120 years, there were about 120 or so of these charcoal iron furnaces. So there's a fair amount. You can stop and think about all the wood that was cut for charcoal. Now, the furnaces in the valley were pretty typical. They were pretty much all the the same. They look just, one looked just like the other. In fact, there's the Roaring Run furnace over in Botetourt County. You can see a good example of the four-arch there and how it's made of stones. The Graham furnace in Wythe County, again, see the four-arch in the front. Here's the Clifton furnace. This is over in Allegheny County. You can see the four-arch in the front there, and here's the three-arch over here on the side. The Boyer furnace in Shenandoah County. The interesting thing about the Boyer furnace was they used some wood beams in the construction. Of course, the wood beams have long since rotted away, and fortunately the stone hasn't fallen down. The Mount Tory furnace, sadly, doesn't look like this today. If you know where it is and you've seen it, it's just a pile of stones, isn't it? But anyway, that's the way it looked like several years ago. And again, it's a typical furnace of the time. What's that? Lyndhurst. Is that where the Tory furnace is? Mount Tory, excuse me. The Washington furnace in Franklin County. Again, pretty much typical furnace. All right, let me talk a little bit about slavery on the iron plantation. Now, as I said, the work of an iron plantation was pretty labor intensive, especially making the charcoal. Somebody had to cut the wood, the trees. Somebody had to haul the wood into the charcoal pit. Had to make the charcoal. Somebody had to dig the limestone, the iron ore. You had to have farmers to raise crops and so forth. And when the ironmongers first moved into the valley, many of them came down from Pennsylvania. Many were of a religious sect that didn't believe in slavery. And so therefore they did not want to own slaves. But over time they realized they just wasn't enough workforce. Most frontier families, all the sons, working on their own homestead. So there wasn't a surplus of labor. And so what they had to do is the ironmongers had to go east, across the mountain, to the plantations in eastern Virginia and rent slaves. That's the way they started. And so each year they'd have to go over to rent slaves. Well, of course, the plantations weren't going to let the slaves go during the planting season or during the harvesting season. So they could only get slaves to work, at odd times, like in the winter time, which is bad because it's hard to do a lot of processes in the winter. The streams would freeze up and they couldn't run the bellows for the furnace. And so that became very problematic. Also, there's no guarantee that they'd get the same slave year after year, because once one became knowledgeable in what he was doing, he may be already rented out to somebody else the next year. And also, too, the eastern planters realized, hey, this guy's got skills, I'm going to charge more for him each year. And so, regretfully, the Valley ironmasters succumbed to having to own their own slaves. But the interesting thing about it was different working on an iron plantation than it was in an agrarian plantation. Mainly because producing iron was a quality project, not quantity. In the East, you pick as much cotton as you possibly can. But because the ironmonger made his living of producing a certain type of iron, a certain quality, consistency was necessary. And so once you got somebody trained to do something, it's very important to keep that person so they could continue to produce the same quality of iron. And so many slaves became very skilled at making charcoal or at actually working at the iron furnace. But of course, you can't incentivize people to, if you work hard, you produce a lot, and then the next day they want you to just keep producing more and more and more. It just doesn't work that way. You can't get quality, and that's what the ironmongers were looking for. And so they came up with a system which would incentivize higher productivity. And they come up with a sort of a standard, okay? You're expected to produce this much charcoal in a given period of time. You're expected to produce this much iron in a given time. You're expected to cut this many cords of wood in this certain time. So they'd come up with a reasonable quota, but then anything that was produced over the quota, the slave was paid for. It's called the Overworked System. And so as a consequence, many slaves would work extra hours, extra hard, work holidays in order to get the incentives of the overwork. They were usually paid, and they weren't actually given money, but they were, a log was kept. And so they could then, their extra hours could convert that into goods at the company store there at the iron plantation. So many slaves were able to buy some nice things for their families by the Overworked System. Regretfully, only with a few exceptions that I found, could a slave buy his freedom, which of course was the one thing he really wanted more than anything else. But slaves were considered highly skilled. They were held in high esteem because oftentimes they were very skilled workers and a critical part of helping the iron master maintain the quality of product that he wanted to do. Well, by the time the Civil War came, the Virginia iron industry in the valley was pretty well defunct. The furnaces had kind of been shutting down, and that's because in the north, the northern furnaces were more efficient. Transportation infrastructure favored the north. Tariffs from imported iron favored the north. Markets, most of the construction that was going on, the railroad building, skyscrapers were beginning to go up that needed iron and steel. These were mostly in the north. And also, too, southern furnaces did not keep up with the newest technology. And this is one of the byproducts of slavery, because in a northern furnace, somebody might work in a furnace for a while and learn some special technique that the iron master had developed. And then he would leave and go work at another furnace. Well, he would take that technology with him. And so over time, the technology improved and improved and improved in the north. But because there was no transition of workforce in the south, because they were slaves, they were bound to that furnace, and that's where they stayed. Therefore, they couldn't trade technology, and as a consequence, southern furnaces pretty much stayed static as far as technological advances are concerned. And of course, also the new metal was steel. And none of the southern furnaces actually created steel. Pig iron was it, and that was... so as a consequence, by the time the Civil War came, the southern iron industry was pretty well on its edge, the end. But interestingly enough, the Civil War helped the iron industry because the Confederacy needed iron. And the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond would buy all the iron they could possibly get a hold of. Colonel Anderson, who ran the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, actually came to the valley and talked to the iron guys. Hey, get your furnace going again. I'll buy all the iron you can make. In fact, Tredegar Iron Works even bought some furnaces and started to operate them so that they produced iron that could be sent down to Richmond to the Tredegar Iron Works. But the Civil War, of course, hurt the iron industry. There's no more cheap labor after the Civil War. And of course, the Tredegar Iron Works paid the iron it got in Confederate notes. Needless to say, were not worth much after the war. And of course, the transportation infrastructure in the South was pretty well destroyed. Railroads were torn up, and so there's really no way to ship iron once it got made. And of course, all the money was in the hands of northern entrepreneurs, and the technology was also in the hands of the northern industrialists. And so the Civil War, I would say, that pretty well ended the frontier iron age in Virginia. However, iron continued to be manufactured in Virginia. In fact, a new modern age of iron production began about in the 1880s, when northern capital started to flow into the south. The railroads were rebuilt, and so as a consequence, a lot of the new iron furnaces were actually constructed in Virginia. And these were, instead of being stones, this was just an iron shell still lined with a fire brick. But instead of using charcoal, they used coke, which comes from coal. So there's no more need to produce the charcoal. And of course, it had steam power, so they could use hoists to lift the iron ore and ingredients up and dump them in the top of the furnace, so you didn't have to build your furnace next to a hill. And of course, you had steam power, you could run your bellows, so you didn't need water power for that. And of course, these northern furnaces, and of course the new furnaces could produce steel. And iron continued to be produced in Virginia until the early 1920s. In fact, that's the Lowmore Iron Furnace, which is the largest, which is over, in Allegheny County. That was the largest iron furnace in Virginia. that right there, there's 2 furnaces there in Lowmore, and they had another furnace in Covington. It was a huge operation. And they produced iron until 1926. Well, what's there today to see? Not a lot. Of course, the two great examples are the Clifton Furnace in Page County and the Roaring Run Furnace in Botetourt County. Both of these are in the National Forest, and the Forest Services carefully maintain these furnaces to keep them from deteriorating. So you can certainly see furnaces around. If you go to the little town of Columbia Furnace, you'll see the Superintendents House, the iron furnace Superintendents House, still being lived in today. In fact, the mule and horse stables, needless to say, they've been converted into something else, as you can see the air conditioners in the window, but that was what they used to keep the mules and the horses in for the iron furnace. And I don't know, you've probably seen this bridge along the interstate. Well, that was what's left over of the old Valley branch of the B&O, which, of course, was constructed primarily to help move the iron out into the east. And the manager's house at Liberty Furnace, beautiful house. And that's been there forever and still lived in. And here's the Tuile Race, where the water came from a spring down this race and ran the water wheel for the Liberty Furnace. I don't know if you've been over to Buena Vista and seen the North River Canal locks, which are, where they would bring the boats up the river to get iron. And occasionally you'll find remnants of old railroad beds. This is the DKey Railroad, which went all the way from Liberty Furnace into the town of Edinburgh and actually terminated at the Forest Service headquarters. You can see the little mounds and whatnot all the way through Edinburgh. And of course, all through the mountains, you find where dirt has been moved and piled up and shifted and whatnot from, left over from the old open pits or roads or inclines. And then occasionally you'll come across an old drift mine that's dug back into the hill. But it's rapidly disappearing. Like I say, Mount Tory Furnace is a good example. I mean, it's a pile of stones, pretty soon it won't even be that. So there's really just a little left to remind us of the critical importance of iron on Virginia's frontier, even though it lasted 100 years. Well, thank you. And you can get books on Amazon.com. These 3 are available. I also have a couple, some of the Shenandoah Iron and a River of Iron back in the back if you're interested. I'll be happy to sign them if you like. But at any rate, stand ready for questions.
I was curious, to what time period does the technology date to that, preceded what happened here in Virginia? All the structure of the furnace and everything that you talked about, where did they draw that from?
England, or Europe mostly.
And before that, or how far back does that sort of stone furnace bridge structure go?
Way back.
To the Iron Age, or
Yeah, I mean, the Romans had various Catalan forges, different kinds of forges that they could, very much like a Bloomery Forge, that they could produce iron in. And of course the Europeans, especially in England and France, were probably the leaders and always were ahead of American technology. Like steel was produced, Bessemer came up, he was British, came up, the way to make steel, and so.
It's fascinating.
Did that help you, Aiden?
Yeah, I was just curious,
Yeah, I sort of marked from the Bloomery Forge to the charcoal furnace. To me, 1830 is kind of the date I sort of say that's when but yet in 1810 there were still some of these furnaces in operation. So nothing happened, like this. It's usually, kind of like that over time.
During the Civil War, when the Yankees invaded the valley, what happened to the furnaces at that time?
Well, very interesting. Well, of course, naturally, the iron furnaces were, primary targets of the Union forces that came into Virginia. And, of course, they could burn what they could. They could burn the bridge house because it's made of wood. They could burn the cast house, which is basically a shed. And, of course, maybe destroy the water wheel of the bellows. But they couldn't burn the furnace down because it's made of stones. And so oftentimes when they'd come in, they'd raid, they'd do as much destruction as they could, but literally within weeks afterwards, they'd have the furnace going again. Now the trick, of course, was to know that the Federals were coming, because you had to get the furnace shut down before they got there. Because, if you're going through the smelting process, you got all this iron being liquefied and drippings, its way down to the bottom into a pool. If all of a sudden you cut the air supply off and the heat supply, the iron will solidify. And they call that a salamander if it solidifies at the bottom of the furnace. And if it solidified, of course, it would be almost impossible to get out. And so they often, of course, they got word, okay, Yankees are coming, shut the furnace down, and they would. But then get it going again pretty much after the war. Now, it's interesting. Furnace workers were exempt from military service because the iron was needed by the Treader Grinding Works. And I have several accounts of where some northern sympathizers would actually create jobs, and so, I need 4 more workers here for my iron furnace, okay guys, just stay low, hide, and they therefore could skip military service. Usually they got caught and were chased out of town, but at any rate, some of that kind of stuff went on. Yes, ma'am.
With the earlier Bloomery furnaces, have you seen any evidence that they were doing hearth refining into higher carbon steel?
All right, say that again. Any evidence that they're doing what?
Hearth refining or anything like that to make higher carbon steel?
No, well,